Thank you very much for having me here, and on behalf of our board of directors and our chair, Rick Hansen, the man in motion himself, I'm just grateful to share this story with you. And I thought I'd start off with a little bit about this fish. So Fraser River white sturgeon is one of the oldest species in the Fraser. It's outlived 2 ice ages. It can live up to 200 years old and grow to 6 meters in length. It is a unique species, like salmon and others, that can use fresh and saltwater habitats. And they also, being an apex species, they share habitat with other iconic species like salmon and ulican. And being an apex species means that they eat everybody else. And so we refer to sturgeon sometimes as the canary in the coal mine on the health of the Fraser. So it's a really important part of our ecosystem. They're very slow growing. They reproduce, the females only reach reproductive maturity at 26 years, 12 for males, and they only spawn every 6 to 10 years in the wild. So it's quite a unique species comparatively to salmon on a 2 or 4 year cycle. And so it creates a very unique dynamic for finding recovery for a species like this because it is so slow growing and long lived. It is an icon of the Fraser River. This was really a species like other, a natural resource species like other natural resources that really this province was built on. And right now, we are facing the biggest issue in this population are juvenile sturgeon, and they're on the decline, but there's hope, and we'll chat about that. So for a bit of a history lesson, between 1892 and 1920, there were over 7.5 million pounds of white sturgeon landed and harvested, shipped from the Fraser River at New Westminster. And this was a highly coveted meat food fishery, also very valuable for caviar as well, and it was shipped all over the world. So these fish that were pulled out of the Fraser at this time, they were up to 20 feet long. They were 1,500 to 2,000 pounds. They were big old fish that really represented the brood stock of the species. So we compare it to clear cutting an old growth forest. So the population at this time was really clear cut from the Fraser River. Next, there we go. Okay, so so that was our first major issue with the species, was having this clear cut happen. Then in the early 1990s, there was a very unusual occurrence where a number of very old white sturgeon were found dead on the banks of the Fraser. No one really knew what had happened and why they were washing up dead, but there were dozens of these fish and they were quite large. They were examined by the provincial and federal fisheries, and many of them were female. Most of them were female. And it was a unique year in that the biologists think that it was a bit of a perfect storm of issues that could impact a species like this. So you had a year where there was a big sockeye run, there was a lot of fish in the river, but it was a warm time of year and the water levels were very low. So you had a situation where these fish were coming down for the buffet and gorging themselves on this amazing fish, this amazing salmon that they love, but ran into challenges being able to digest and having the enough oxygen in the waters, because the water was so low and the oxygen was being taken up by the carcasses, et cetera, that were in the water at the time. So it was really a convergence of a number of variables that we think led to this die-off. But we really didn't know. And it was very alarming to a lot of people, especially individuals that were passionate about the ecosystem. They were passionate about the Fraser. And so clearly there needed to be something done to figure out what was going on. And so in 1997, Rick Hansen founded the Fraser River Sturgeon Conservation Society. And a lot of people probably don't know that he's really quite a long-time conservationist fisher for sturgeon and for salmon, very passionate about the ecosystem. And it has a strong connection. The fishing and the outdoors have a strong connection for him throughout his life. But in particular, he was on his way home from a fishing trip when he was in the accident that resulted in his paralysis and being in a wheelchair. So it's been a really, really key part of his life. And he was very passionate about sturgeon. So he brought this group of people together, and the individuals in the photo that you are seeing here, with the exception of the gentleman on the far right over the logo at the head of the sturgeon, that is the late Calvin Higano. All of them are still involved with what we do. So for over 20 years, these individuals have been passionate supporters of what we do, and they're still involved with all of our activities. And Rick has recently rejoined us as chair, so he's leading our charge again, as in those days. So in order to figure out what was going on, the society had to get those brains around what is it that we're after? What is our vision? And it came up with that the sturgeon populations in the Fraser being strong, healthy, and sustainable for future generations. Now, the unique thing about this particular population of white sturgeon, so as an aside, there's 29 different species of sturgeon around the world. White sturgeon is one of them, and that's actually the species name. In the Fraser River, it is the last remaining truly wild population of this species anywhere in the world. And so our population here, our stock here in the Fraser, it's special in that it is the last in the world, but it's also special because we have a chance. It's wild still, and we have a chance to protect and see the recovery for the future. So it was, we knew it was a challenge, but it was inspiring as well. But in order to figure out what was going on with the population, we needed to know where we were starting from. And so you can't know where you're going if you don't know where you are or where you've been. And in 2000, the Society started its Lower Fraser White Sturgeon Monitoring and Assessment Program. And this was a program that was designed to essentially get a baseline population number on these fish. So then we could move on from there to know what the trends are and use the data we were collecting to be able to figure out what was going on. And this model is quite unique, yet very simple in one sense, in that the volunteers that were involved with collecting our data, the measurements that they were collecting from each fish that they encountered was their length, so their fork length for size. So the tip of the snout to the fork of the tail was the fork length. And we also take measurements around their pectoral fins, just behind the pectoral fins, for girth. We check them for other anomalies, other injuries, any other markings that are unique. And we also then notate where the fish was caught. So the study area has markers where we can notate where the fish was encountered and where it received its tag, and also then where it was recaptured in the future. The volunteers that helped to be a part of this were from many, many sectors. And as you can see here, this is a really diverse group of people that were passionate about the fish, and they all came to come to work together to find the solutions, find the ways that we could make a difference for this species, but they're coming to it from very, very different perspectives. The perspectives from First Nations fishers and recreational anglers, government, enforcement. There was such a wide range of perspectives, but because we had that, it meant that we could really start to get a very clear picture of this species and benefit from that amazing knowledge from all of those different groups. Okay. Our work is made possible by thanks to the contributions from private donors, different foundations, the province of British Columbia, as well as the government of Canada. We apply for research grants, and we did that. We continue to do that, as we are the only organization on the Fraser that is an independent, third-party, unbiased research group that is tracking the health of this population. And so we benefit from these types of contributions to keep our work going. So as I was mentioning before, when we start looking at where the fish are caught, so as I mentioned, we collect data on how long they are, their girth, we look at all the other items, but we also notate where they are. So in order to do that in a consistent way throughout all of our volunteers, we broke the Fraser River down into 4 sections. A, B, C, and D. And then in between there, right from the mouth of the Fraser at Steveston, all the way up past Yale, each of those 200, just over 200 river kilometers are marked. And so when our volunteers encounter fish, wherever they are on the river, they can mark what actual kilometer that is. And that, again, gives us a picture of where the fish are, where they're going. And also it starts to give us an idea of where on the Fraser they're more typically caught. So now we start thinking about things like habitat, why are they hanging out there, the times of years that the fish are caught and encountered. So we really could start to get some quite broad information just from this tagging program. So over 20 years, these are our, this is our profile from up to 2020, so last year. And this basically shows you what's happening with the population right now as of that 2020 time. So the black line at the very top is the overall, all the population that we've sampled. So it's all the fish from 60 centimeters long right up to 279 centimeters long. So that's what the whole population is doing. So you can see that over time, we had a little bit of a peak back in 2005, 2004, 2005, and then it's been on a decline with a couple of little blips and along the way, but essentially it has been in a decline. You can see by the other lines. So for example, the red line, those are the fish that are the bigger fish. So those are the large size fish. They're surviving, and they are also growing into larger size classes. The blue line is the mid-size fish, and they've also been growing into the larger size classes. But it's the green line is the one that causes us the most concern, because those are the ones that are the little guys. That's the next generation of this species. And in terms of the numbers of broodstock, for example, that red line is up at about 22,000, 23,000 fish, but the juveniles are down at 9 or 10,000 fish. That's a disproportionate number of juveniles to what we should see based on the size of the broodstock. So this has been able to tell us that there's areas where there's concern. So then the question becomes, so what? And now what? So as of 2020, as I was saying, to date, we have deployed over 70,000 tags. And so when I say that we deployed tags, the tags they're a small glass little tag that is about the size of a long grain, a piece of 1 grain of long grain rice. It's very small. It's inserted behind the bony plate on the head on the left side. And there's a little soft spot there where we can insert this tag. It is subcutaneous, but this location where we're putting it, it doesn't cause damage. It doesn't hurt the fish. And it's also an area where there's the least amount of significant growth. So we won't lose track of the tag in the body of the fish. So that was, it was chosen to go there for that reason. We've collected over 170,000 samples. So that includes all of our recaptures. So we have approximately a 74%, 75% recapture rate. That does change a little bit depending on where you are in the river. Sometimes in some areas, the population has a higher recap rate because fish are hanging out there more often and it's consistent. Other places we see a lower recap rate. But we believe that we have approximately 75% of the population tagged. The estimate for the population in 2020 was 44,000 fish, 930. Now, I always get the question that how can you have 70,000 tags out and only a population of 44,000 fish? And the difference is, or the reason is that we account for mortality. So part of it is the natural, over that period of over 20 years, there is a natural level of mortality. We have not seen an extensive mortality like we have in the past. So it is a natural mortality. These fish also, as I mentioned previously, they go out to ocean. And so sometimes they stay in the Fraser, but they also travel out to the ocean. And on any given year, where we see different fish. So we don't sample the same fish every year. We know that they travel and they're moving in and out of the system. So that's why at this particular time and this year, those were the fish that were in the Fraser that we were able to sample. But because we have this level of data, and for perspective, especially given that we have a political campaign going on right now, and I'm not getting into politics, I'm just making a comparison, and that when you get an opinion poll call, one of the pollsters call you to take your opinion and see what you think about the world of whichever candidate or what your opinions are, they base the opinions that are collected, let's say, for Western Canada, and they base that on maybe 3,000 or 5,000 phone calls, samples. This, at 170,000 samples, we have such a tight confidence level at over 96 to 97% confidence levels in the numbers because there's so much data. That's not to say that the 5,000 samples of an opinion don't mean that it's an opinion. The difference is simply has tighter confidence bounds because there's so much information. It also gives us the ability to see in this particular model, which is a very unique population data model, that we can see that if we do nothing today, the population will decline to very, very serious detrimental levels in 30 years or less. The way this model works is, so you can see on the left-hand side, the assessment period up to 2020. The model takes into account fish that are sampled, that are noted now, that are alive now. We know roughly how old they are based on a whole other formula, but we know roughly how old they are, and we know how many are alive right now. Therefore, they were alive 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 100 years ago, depending on the circumstance. But it also means that taking into account a conservative level of mortality, et cetera, as well as that traveling in and out of the population or in and out of the Fraser River, we can forecast now what happens. So if we do nothing, what this is showing right now is that this is if that we take no actions, we do nothing. Nothing changes, we do all the same things we are right now. And you can see that black line is continuing to go down and continuing to go down until it levels off, and then it's harder to project as you get farther. The shaded areas around the lines, those are showing confidence bounds. So that's saying that the shady parts are much more narrow, closer to the 2020 mark. As you move forward, obviously the confidence is not as much because you're taking into account a lot of different variables as you move forward. But this basically tells us what is going to happen to the population if we don't do anything. But wait, there's more. Unless I've completely lost all of you now, but there is more and there is hope. So because we can see this with a model like this, and this is what is amazing about the use and the application of this data, just from this little tagging program that we started all those years ago, we can look at this and say, okay, if we can increase survival by 1 to 1.6 times, the population will start to increase. And it doesn't sound like a lot. It's not a lot of an increase in survival. And when I say survival, I'm talking about those juveniles that we see more coming into the population. The fish are living longer. We're seeing the population stabilize because these fish are surviving. We will actually see it increase. And because of the way the model's built, we can actually show the projection of what that really looks like. And so the top one, the A chart, it's saying that if we were to increase the survival just by 1 time, you can see even with that, within 5 years, the population starts to level off, especially that green line, which is the one that's such a concern for us. So we can actually start to see that line stable off and level off and potentially increase. So that in itself is amazing. But if you look at B, the B chart, at 1.6 times what our current recruitment is, so recruitment's just the numbers of fish that are coming into our steady space, you can see how it increases. You can see all the lines as you move forward. And if you could move forward through the whole screen past 2035, you can see they increase. So this gives us hope. And that's why it's so critical that we keep using this data, we keep analyzing this data, and we continue to collect more and more information moving forward. So based on this data, so as I was saying before, that we look at things like where the fish are caught, the conditions that there are in that environment, the time of year that they're caught, and we can see patterns in that information. So we can see that, let's say, X number of fish are sampled in this particular area of the Fraser in this type of conditions, and they're all around a certain size, same size. That starts to get us thinking a little bit about what they're doing there. What is it, the habitat? Is it food? And so in order to get to that long-term survival and that increased one times or 1.6 times survival rate, we've been able to break it down to some pretty serious impacts that actually aren't impossible to address. So habitat loss, that is a big one. The Fraser River is an industrial river. It's very busy and there's a lot of development on the Fraser, but it's not impossible to protect certain areas. And one thing about the Sturgeon Society is that we're not against industry and we're not against development. I like to call it the no, but yes. So oftentimes we're brought into conversations, planning, development conversations with developers, government, you name it. Like I said, I'll talk to everybody and anybody if they'll listen. And we're brought into these conversations because we can help find those no but yes solutions when you're wanting to develop something. So we can tell what's going on in the habitat in the area where there's a plan that's coming together, and we can say, no, don't do it this way, but yes, do it that way, or no, don't do it here, but do it there. And so it gives some flexibility to work collaboratively with industry and development that's going on the river, and not and keep those conversations open, keep the communication open. And we've had the ability to have a pretty significant influence on the decisions that are made for some plans, simply because we have the evidence and the science to explain. We are a research group, as Anne was mentioning, and so we're not we're evidence-based. We're not political. We're not in that activist kind of a role. We share information and advocate for what is happening to this fish and how to see recovery. So habitat loss is a big one. Gillnet bycatch, that is also a very significant impact for these fish. And as you know, we've got a huge pink run coming through the Fraser right now of pink salmon. And there's a lot of activity on the river, and gillnets that are used by the commercial and First Nations fishery. These fish, or these nets rather, they're very effective for catching salmon, but they're also, they're not very selective. So they'll catch everything else as well. So they catch sturgeon, they catch steelhead, they catch other non-targeted salmon species. And so when that happens, the mortality issue for sturgeon, if you can imagine it, like the humans come down for the buffet of salmon, and so do the sturgeon. And so the sturgeon get tangled up in these salmon nets. The nets are left there for a number of hours or overnight or whatever the case may be, and they essentially suffocate because the salmon are so heavy, and they basically crush the fish underneath, and they can't get free. So that's a big issue, but it's not impossible to deal with. Low numbers of juvenile sturgeon, as I was saying, figuring out where these fish hang out. Sturgeon are broadcast spawners. So basically the females move when they're ripe and ready to go. They move into certain parts of the river, typically back channels where you've got a little bit of water flow, but it's not super fast. And they just broadcast, they let the eggs go and the males come and they let go, and then you just hope for the best, basically. So it's not like salmon that dig reds and do that. So we need to know, once that spawning happens, where do those juveniles that come out of that, where do they end up? Where do they go? How do we protect their habitat? We need to know where they are in order to be able to do that. Poaching is also a big one. This is still a very valuable fish. There's a huge black market for caviar and the meat, as well as other fish parts that are used for various purposes, medicines, etc. So poaching is a serious issue, and we work quite closely with enforcement, not not because we're enforcement, because we're not, but for example, if the fisheries officers happen to come across somebody who is poaching a sturgeon, I've had phone calls from the officers saying, okay, we've just intercepted a vehicle that has 6 sturgeon in the trunk, and these people are going to be detained and they're going to be charged. And what they need from us at the Sturgeon Society is an impact statement to say, okay, for that car or that truck that's got 6 sturgeon in the back, and let's say they all die and the fish are 5 to 6 feet, those are breeding fish. So now you're pulling them out of the population. So we try to help the courts to understand the impact when they're trying to make those decisions on what happens with those situations. Fisheries management is huge. There is a very active recreational fishery on this species. The provincial government is responsible for the management of the recreational fishery. The population is deemed healthy enough to sustain this fishery. It's extremely it's not well managed, but it's extremely managed in terms of regulations and requirements for people to fish them. But it is also a very big piece of the economy. There's a lot of it's not just people coming out fishing and buying licenses. They're also going to restaurants. They're going to hotels. There's a huge spinoff from that part of tourism that affects a lot of communities all the way along the Fraser. So the fisheries management side, it can get quite complex because there's a lot of variables involved for this to focus on the recovery of the fish. So the bottom line is the survival means more juveniles, because the more juveniles we have, the better luck that they'll survive and we'll have a bigger population growth. So we're really focusing our energy on juveniles. So that means understanding long-term use of habitat, as I was mentioning, understanding the spawning areas so we can protect those parts of habitat, juvenile rearing, making sure that we can protect them from whether it's predation, whether it's development, et cetera. Best handling practices for all the fisheries that are on the river. And so that's the recreational fishery, but it's also the gill net fishery, the salmon fishery as well. There's best practices and there's changes that we can make simply in how the fishing is done that will make a positive impact on the fish and mean survival. And then of course, innovation, looking at unique and applied technologies that think outside the box and how to paint and how to present rather the picture of what's happening with this population. So for the first few, this is an example of Hurling Island back channel. And so Hurling Island, you may have heard about, it's been set a lot of profile with some challenges with habitat destruction, and we've been quite involved with presenting our science to protect this area. But what's unique about this and why I wanted to show you is when we talk about juvenile rearing and spawning and protections and those sorts of things, that this is the kind of cobble that they need. So you can see the gravel is all different sizes. There's some nice gaps and little hiding places between the rocks, and that's what they need. So this part of the channel, obviously it's dry because we could walk across it at this point, but when it's in freshet, just before the fish spawn, and there's a lot of water coming through there, it's a perfect spot for them to spawn. And we were able to prove that they do spawn actively in this channel, and thanks to these types of efforts and the information from the tagging program, we were able to prove that this was an area that was sensitive, and we've been able to protect it from mostly from fishing at this point, but also from development as well. Best handling practices for all of the fisheries. So as I was mentioning with the recreational fishery, there are a series of best handling practices for angling white sturgeon in British Columbia. And we worked collaboratively with the province, with the Angling Guide Association, with recreational sturgeon fishers, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, et cetera, to really come up with what are the 5 things, to make it simple for folks, what are the 5 things that we really want to make sure that people do if they're going to go out and fish this fish. They need to do it with care. And here's what that looks like. So there are 5 priority guidelines that folks need to abide by when they're angling fish. And if they don't abide by this, these guidelines support the Fisheries Wildlife Act that protects these fish, and it provides support for that if people are handling the fish inappropriately. So it helps awareness, it helps education, but it also supports the enforcement side to help protect the fish. We made a video about this, so if you're curious, we have a video on our website that's called Can You Handle It? And this was based on those guidelines, and we wanted to be able to show people very visually, this is what you do. This is how you prepare, and this is what you do if you're going to handle it and handle the fish. And so we were very grateful for the support from the province of British Columbia and the Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation for helping us to receive the funding to put this together. And now it is part of the, when you go to buy a white sturgeon conservation license, if you're fishing in freshwater, so you're fishing above the Mission Bridge up into the valley, that it actually, when you go to buy your license, it asks you if you're aware of these, and you have to tick the box that after you've seen and been aware of these guidelines. So it's a great way that we've been able to put something out there that helps to make a positive impact. This is as I was mentioning before, with the gill net fishery. So this is an example of a mid-sized, small to mid-sized sturgeon that washed up on shore, tangled in a gill net a number of years ago. But it's a good example, and it keeps us inspired to find new ways of working with communities that are using these technologies, working with the First Nations and commercial fisheries. We've worked on a ghost net project so that any nets that are lost or broken off in the river that continue to fish, we can remove them and help to protect the fish that are coming through. So best practices for the gill net fishery include short wait times. So the fishers need to remove their nets in a timely manner. So rather than leaving them overnight, for example, they check them every few hours. So it increases the likelihood of survival if there happens to be a sturgeon in there. And that's just one example. The other is we're working to look at sustainable fishing methods that move away from gill net use and introduce other methods that are still effective, but will have less of an impact. And so understanding that these are all different methods that are fishing, the gill nets will likely be continued to be used, but if we can integrate other options, then that also reduces the negative impact and helps sturgeon survival. This is an example of our ghost net removal team crew on removing a net from just near Agassiz here. So. Innovative technology. So thinking outside the box, it can be very overwhelming knowing that this is a 200-year-old fish, and we've been studying it for 20 odd years. And that's not even a mature spawning cycle yet for a female if they're only spawning at 26. So we got some way to go still, but being innovative and thinking outside of the box is really, really critical. And one of the amazing technologies that I was absolutely inspired by a few years ago was side scan sonar. And so as an aside, I thought it was an interesting story that Rick Hansen was at a conference where he had seen the use of this technology, and he'd been talking with an individual that works with this. And he started to think, okay, well, maybe this can be used for sturgeon. So we invited the group that does this technology, that makes this technology. We invited them out onto the Fraser, and they showed us, they set up all of the gear and the equipment, and it was amazing. And then the technician, who's an ex-Navy officer, he looked at us and said, well, I only have one problem. And we thought, oh my gosh, with all this equipment on board on the boat, what could that possibly be? And he just looked at us and he said, I don't know what a sturgeon looks like. So this technology is so incredibly powerful. As you can see, you can count the fins on these fish. And so Rick's attitude was, knowing that this technology originally was designed for the Coast Guard for body recovery, we thought, well, if you can find a 5-foot person or a 6-foot person, you could probably find a 6-foot fish. And so we applied this to what we do, and we were able to show some pretty neat footage. So now you can actually show people a little bit closer about what these fish look like and where they are. Some other cool photos. So the way that side scan works is it casts its sonar and then creates a shadow. So what you're seeing that looks like the fish, those are the shadows of the fish. So the fish is a little bit lighter part on the side of those shadows. Those are the fish. We also use unique equipment for scanning fish. So in order to know when you encounter a fish, whether this fish has any data on it yet, we scan them with these scanners. These are high performance scanners that can read the tag in the fish, and we keep it up to date and as top of the line as we can as this program has continued to grow. But this is also a unique use for this technology, and you can see, it's a little bit blurry, but you can see on the screen that there's a number that pops up because each of those tags has a unique 10-digit alphanumeric code that is unique to that fish forever once it receives it. And every time someone encounters that fish and scans it with one of our scanners, the number pops up, and then we can start to see the history on these fish as they're encountered. So what will it really take for us to see the recovery of this dinosaur fish? And really, it is action and it's advocacy. And we really need to make sure that we're continuing to get our data and use that data when there are development plans underway. And we've actually been able to, even as recently as a few years ago, when the conversations were beginning about what was going to happen to the Massey Tunnel, and was it going to be a bridge? Was it going to be another tunnel? What was it going to be? And we're still having conversations about that. But we were invited fairly early on in that process to provide some perspective and data on what's going on in the habitat around those areas, so that when the plans are being made, the sturgeon habitat is being taken into consideration as well. We have data that supports abstaining from fishing when there's spawning periods, and we were so successful with this evidence when we were able to prove, like the hurling channel piece, that the anglers voluntarily stayed out of the areas that we identified as spawning areas. And so we worked in a positive, collaborative way with the angling community, and they voluntarily stayed out of those sensitive areas. And now there are some of those areas are regulated closures that the province has regulated, but initially it was a voluntary closure, and a really great example of the commitment of the community and the recreational fishers to help support this resource. We also present our information to industry, being, again, the angling community, others that are involved with the resource, to just demonstrate the link to sturgeon to salmon, to oolakan. And like I said before, because it's an apex species, it really has that special role. And because it's hardwired to survived a couple ice ages, and they're so long lived, if there's something going wrong with them, then we know that it's important, and we know it's going to affect others, and it is an indicator of the health of the Fraser watershed. And then, of course, to continue to support sturgeon as that species and help to keep a measurement on those environmental issues. So making a difference is continuing to do our research and monitor, use that evidence, use that science to advocate for what the fish needs based on what we find, and working collaboratively with others that can make a difference, decision makers and others, making sure that we are always improving on best practices for all of these fisheries and all of the development, and then encouraging people to be involved, to help tell the story and get involved with what we do. And all of that adds up, and all of that makes a difference. So that's the tail end of my talk. And thank you so much for listening to me. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. And I'll stop sharing my screen so I can see everybody properly again. And yeah, thank you again so much for inviting me to be here and for listening to my fish story.
That was an excellent presentation, Sarah, and I'm sure people will have some questions for you.
Thank you. Thanks, Anne. I'm relieved because I don't know what I said.
Oh.
Yeah, so I'll let you. Who's Gareth?
Yes.
Yes. Hi.
I think it was last week or very recently, I heard that there was a report of a very large sturgeon, supposedly the largest one ever caught.
Yes.
But was that one of the biggest ever recorded?
It was, well, from what I understand, so no, we do have larger fish that are on record in our study. The largest one that we have, that news report, that fish had been scanned and tagged. The larger one that we have in our study, we weren't able to tag it because it was, or scan it because it was too big. And so technically, yes, it's probably one of the larger ones that we're seeing, but we have seen and had reports of larger ones as well. But the biggest thing and the most important thing is that is an amazing fish. That, and to bring that fish in to even raise awareness for people to be in, to even see that is just an incredible thing. So we like to see those healthy fish, and it's not easy to do that. Those the gear's not meant for fish quite that big. So it's always I always get lots of phone calls when that when those reports come in.
I have a question. Do they go way up the Fraser? How far up the Fraser do they go? And are they allowed to catch them for food a certain way up the Fraser?
They are not a food fishery. They are non-retention only. We hope for the day that they can be a food fishery again, because that means that we've done our job right and we've been able to find a way of managing the numbers of fish that come out of the Fraser. We know there is some retention in the gill net fishery, but we don't have good numbers on that. So you're not to. But they're quite far up the Fraser. There's white sturgeon that are way up past Hell's Gate. They can go through Hell's Gate, which is quite extraordinary in itself. There are white sturgeon in other river systems like the Nechako River. And the difference is that further up the river you go into those other water systems or those river systems, like for the example of the Nechako, those fish are endangered up there. So the classifications for like SARA listing species, not SARA like me, but species at risk, the lower Fraser white sturgeon that we're doing our work on, and also that supports the recreational fishery, is deemed as threatened. It's not an endangered listing because it's still deemed, as I said, healthy enough to support this other industry. Up further into the Nechako, those ones are listed as endangered, and they actually have a hatchery program on the Nechako to try to restore that population up there. And that presents a unique challenge for us too, because if those fish find their way down to hang out with our wild fish, then that creates competition and other issues related to those cross genetics, etc. Does that answer your question, Anne?
Yes, it does. Yes. Do they all? I know the Columbia has sturgeon as well, and do they go to different rivers?
They do, and that's a really good. I mentioned that and I didn't think of it, so thank you. Yes, the Columbia River does have white sturgeon in it. They also have a hatchery there. But what's fascinating is that in our study over 20 odd years, we've encountered, I think, about 10 or 12 fish that were tagged in the Columbia River and made their way up into the Fraser. So it just shows how far they can travel, and they do go out to ocean. They'll go out they're probably following food, or who knows, we still have a lot to learn, but it presents an interesting challenge for us again, because now you're in cross borders. The fish don't care about the borders or jurisdictions or any of that, right? They've been around long before any of that stuff existed. So they don't care. But that means that if you've got a system like the Columbia where there's a retention fishery and ours is a threatened non-retention fishery, now you've got fish intermingling and at risk from a different fishery. So we work closely across the border with folks that are doing the fish and wildlife management down there. So yeah, sorry, Karen, you had your hand up, I think I saw. Oh, and
unmute.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
I was going to ask if there was any information on what the sturgeon are doing, what part of their life they're living when they actually go out to the ocean. And are they staying coastal? Do they go do they go across the ocean?
I would really love to know that. You know, this fish, I sometimes compare, and it's probably the wrong comparison, but I sometimes compare it to bees. So you have some bees that go out and they find all the new awesome places to find the nectar and they bring the information back. Sturgeon, some sturgeon go out to ocean and they're gone for years. And we don't really know where they're going, and they make their way back. And then there's other fish that from our data never left the system to our knowledge. They've stayed in certain areas. So they will travel quite far. I don't know if they go across the ocean. I know that there's maybe one or two that have been caught really close to the mouth, like close to the strait. There has been a couple of fish that were caught, or not caught, but that had washed up in West Vancouver at one point. So it was going up there. There's still so much to learn, but it would be very, very difficult to try to sample them in the ocean just because it's such a vast body of water and it's different complexities, obviously. So yeah, lots more to learn still. And Ryan, I think I see a hand on the, you never get that straight.
Yes, I'm not a fisherman. And I'm going to assume that a sturgeon does not put up much of a fight for the angler, because when I see people always bragging about how big a sturgeon they catch, they seem to be able to stand there and hold that fish. And doesn't that fish put up a bit of a fight? And is that detrimental to the life welfare of the health of that sturgeon?
So that's a great question. And I do get that one quite often, because when you do see the reports, you're seeing a fish that's quite docile. It's sitting and it's hanging out. And while you're getting your photograph, or while we sample them and we're taking information from them. So there's no evidence at this point of there being a detrimental impact of angling on the fish. And in fact, that's why we use rod and reel to collect our data, is because that is proven to have the least amount of impact. It doesn't injure them. It's a single barbless hook that the fish that we use in our program. So the fish, in terms of the fight, they're really, really quite active. So they do put up an incredible, people often call them the marlin of the north. So they compare it to some of those other big fish. I don't know, I don't fish those fish, I only fish ours for what we do, but they do an unbelievable fight or experience. But when they finally come into the boat, when we can get them close and actually sample them, any of the fish that are 5 feet and bigger, they stay in the water. You can't bring them out of the water. But our volunteers are highly trained by all of our researchers and our biologists. They're equipped with slings on the sides of their boats and inside of their boats, so that the fish is supported in a cradle, so they're not overly handled. They get their tag, they get their measurements, and they're gone again right away. So in terms of what we do and how we handle them, that we believe has very, very little impact, just because we're dedicated to those best handlings. We try really hard to continue to educate people in the recreational fishery. If they're going to go out and they want to experience this extraordinary fish, then they got to do it properly. And so that's just to be careful and take that care. So
Okay.
I'm getting lost here. Everything keeps moving around.
Sarah, you said that salmon are one of their main food sources, but Oolican as well. It seems to me that I grew up in Chilliwack, and it seems to me there were tons of Oolican, but I don't hear about Oolican anymore. Are their numbers way down as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, they are in the process right now of review for being listed as endangered. They've actually had a very significant crash in recent years. Now, that said, some of the volunteers that we work with, particularly in the First Nations communities that help us as well, we've heard that there's been some hopeful signs, that there's been some spawning activity that, fingers crossed, will continue to support that species and maybe see more of an increase, but they are extremely low. And I mean, Oolican, as you know, are absolutely hardcore protein, and the fish absolutely, that is just the primo. well for them. So unfortunately, they are quite low, and that's why we don't hear about them as much. And the salmon have issues as well, that we've seen a decline in the salmon populations as well. So, but sturgeon will also eat starry flounder and clams and sand crabs and whole kinds of things if it's there. So, Joanne, you have your hand up.
That was a great presentation, Sarah. I mean, they're such an amazing fish. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
Amazing fish. I'm just wondering, COVID and everything on Publicity this coming year. And one other quick question, the scanners and the little.
Sorry, you're breaking up a little bit. I missed a little bit of that there. Sorry.
Your audio is breaking up, Joanne.
The little tags, are they expensive?
The tags, for the equipment, the cost of the equipment, is that you're asking me? So the tags, well, the short answer is yes, they're very specialized. It's very specialized equipment to do what we're doing with them. They are, we benefit from our private donors, et cetera, that help us to purchase tags. We use about it can be anywhere between 3,000 and 5,000 tags get deployed in a year. Really depends on what's going on in the river. But they are roughly, they're about $2 or $3 a tag. So if we're putting out that many, it can get quite costly. The scanners can be anywhere from $600 to $1,200 a scanner. We recently transitioned our scanners, actually, thanks to a contribution we had, and understanding that the tags that are put in the Columbia, for example, or that are put in the Nechako or other areas have a different frequency. And so we updated and upgraded all of our scanners to be dual frequency readers. And so we're constantly having to stay absolutely cutting edge everywhere we can, because it's the integrity of the program. Right? Hope that answers your question. Okay, and Ralph, I saw your hand up there on the thing.
Yes, thank you. I've been told the story that the sports fishing guides go out and repeatedly catch the same fish because they know where they hang out. Is that true? Do the sturgeon have a sort of a home base that they can repeatedly be caught by the sports fishing guides?
I do get that question a lot, and because we've tagged so many fish, and because we have the ability to track essentially how many recaptures, on average, any fish in the entire study over 20 years, the average number of recaptures is only about 4 or 5. So over 20 years, most of these fish on average have only been caught 5 times by the volunteers. That doesn't mean that someone who's not volunteering with us doesn't encounter them. But we've got over 60 volunteers on the river on any given day. So we do have a lot of people out there that, with the likelihood of that fish, eluding our volunteers is a little bit is unlikely. The fish, they move in and out of many areas. So here's a great example. A couple of weeks ago, a fish was encountered by one of our volunteers that we haven't seen since 2000. It was sampled first in 2000, and it was just encountered again a couple of weeks ago. We have others that have been encountered 5 or 6 times in a given year. You're not likely to catch the same fish over and over and over again. Yes, they do sometimes hang out in certain areas. It's really, they're a highly evolved fish, and I always explain this, and you guys would appreciate this with the interest that you guys have in the wildlife, but most species, they have 2 sets of chromosomes. Sturgeon have 6, and they sometimes can have 8 and up to 12. So if you think about it that way, they're so highly evolved, they're beyond us. So in terms of their behaviors, we still have a lot to learn. So we do hear stories about that people are catching the same fish all the time. We have one fish in our study that was encountered, I think it's up to 28 times now in just over 20 years. And it's been encountered almost once a year, different locations, different parts of the river. We kind of call them kind of the dumb fish, but we're just, but what it does is it's telling us a huge story of what that fish is doing, and that gives us a perspective. But that's one fish out of 70,000 odd tags. So, and it's extremely rare for them to have those higher numbers of recaps. It really is. So I know that the angling community does have a lot of knowledge, and we rely on them quite heavily when we're trying to answer some of these questions. But I wouldn't say that they're handling the same fish over and over again in the same year.
Yeah, Gareth.
Gareth?
Oh, just one other one. I believe that they are found in places like Russia and Northern Europe.
Yeah.
I guess if you caught one that happened to travel across from there, you would know, I imagine, from the chromosomes.
You could, but they also would look different. So if we look at, for example, the Russian the fish, the beluga sturgeon, they do look quite different than the white sturgeon. As example, the ones in the the Yangtze River in China, there's ones there that are those fish, and they look a little bit different than ours. So they do have some differences that would make it obvious that the ones that come up from the Columbia, they're white sturgeon as well. So they look very similar to ours. And so that's why the tagging piece is so vital. But if they were coming from totally different areas that were literally a different species of sturgeon, they would look a little bit different.
Well, so you know that they don't travel from country to country, at least. So do you actually liaise with any of the other countries to see what's happening with sturgeon there?
You know, we track quite closely, well, as closely as we can through scientific conferences, presentations. I get phone calls all the time from different groups around the world that some of them are not even dealing with sturgeon or fish species. They just want to know how we made our tagging program, and they think it's amazing. They want to know how we did it. But I had somebody call me about turtles or something once. But anyways, it was, so we do have colleagues in other parts of the world, and we learn a huge amount from them, from the way their fish behave. And, but other than that, it would be very difficult to track them if they were traveling that far. And it's very different management processes. It's different fisheries. Some of the fish are part of a food fishery. So it's a very different landscape in different parts of the world than ours.
Thanks very much. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Question, if I could.
Sure.
I do. I was just the poster that I used was my husband and my son catching one of your sturgeon, and they released it on one of those. Are those boats that do the recreational fishing like that? Are they in your study? Because you must collect data from what they pick up and what they've done.
If the people that your family was fishing with, if they were one of our volunteers, then that data would have been sent to us on that fish. So the volunteers that work with us, they are equipped with, as I was saying, with slings, scans, tape measures, the full kit. So if that guide or individual, some of them are not guides, some of them are just recreational fishers. And if they were part of the program, then absolutely, then that fish would be in our data.
Okay, thank you. So that was it.
Ralph?
Any more questions?
Ralph, is your hand still up or up again? And Ryan, I think your hand is up as well. I don't know. I can't tell.
Yes. My grandparents homesteaded in northern Saskatchewan on the banks of the North Saskatchewan River. I think it was in 1912. Yeah. And early on in the family, while they were there, the story has been passed down in our family of how my grandmother was out fishing in the wintertime for food, and she caught this big fish. It was too big to carry home. She had to pull it home. And today, apparently, there's a bit of a sturgeon catch and release industry on that river. And the whole time I grew up there, we heard very, very little about sturgeon.
Wow.
Yeah, no, I've heard lots of stories from there, and actually, and sturgeon are in the Great Lakes. There's lake sturgeon that are in the Great Lakes as well, and we hear stories about them as well. And yeah, it's such an incredible history, this fish.
So is the Russian caviar from that type of sturgeon, or is it a different type of sturgeon in Russia, the caviar that they get?
Yeah, so the caviar, to my knowledge, the caviar in Russia is beluga caviar. Ours is white sturgeon, and actually there is there's a hatchery, a sturgeon farm in Seychelles, and it's a beautiful facility. We actually work with them as well. Because there's a lot you can learn on the fish when they're in captivity than if you're trying to catch them in the wild, and vice versa. So we share information. We cross our knowledge, etc. But they produce caviar as well, and it's ranked, I think, 4th in the world or something. And they ship meat all over the world, and fish parts for medicine, and all of the fish, all parts of the fish are used. So it's a fascinating side of what we do. So yeah. So I don't know what I'm looking at. So Sylvia, I think. And there is something in the chat. I keep seeing the chat pop up, so I don't know if I'm supposed to look at that or what.
Yeah,
You've got 4 chat.
Joanne, because she was cut off earlier. Joanne sent her question.
Oh.
Chat.
Okay.
If you want to answer Sylvia's question, then we can go to Joanne.
Sure, absolutely.
Oh, can I now? Okay. How many varieties of sturgeon are there? And it's just an amazing fish. I grew up at Agassiz and then moved down to Langley. But the big thing, we loved oolicans. And I'm just delighted to hear that they are coming back, or at least you're working on them.
Yeah.
That was our favorite.
Yeah.
But the variety.
Yeah, so there's 29 different species in the world, and they're all quite different. And they're all sturgeon. There's green sturgeon as well. There's bearded sturgeon. There's there's quite a variety all over the world. There's Danube.
Do they get that's large size?
The white sturgeon and the beluga sturgeon are the biggest. Those ones, the others they don't get quite as big or as long lived.
Good. That's fascinating fish.
It really is.
So then Joanne's question was, what are plans for publicity over the next few years for you guys to tell people?
To tell the story? Well, you know what? I love doing this. This is a great way, because now you guys are all sturgeon experts, and you can share the story on our behalf as well. You know what? We're working really hard to try to get more and more people aware. It's a bottom feeding fish. And it lives in a very murky river. So sometimes it's hard to inspire people when it's hard to see. So we're working on a number of different campaigns. I've been asked to speak at a number of conferences still, and actually to the Agassiz. Sylvia saying that you're in Agassiz, that I was just contacted last week to speak at their museum. They've got a speaker series celebrating these iconic species, and so that sort of thing really helps. You know, we work with media anytime that we can get information out there, and to be honest, when these fish reports end up on the news, that actually helps us sometimes too. And I sometimes get phone calls, and then I can tell the other side of the story. So, you know, we've got events coming up. We've got our annual fundraiser that is running. All the information's on our website. We've got raffles. We've got a gala planned for April. So we've got lots that we're really trying to get more and more people aware and involved with what we do. And if anybody has any ideas or suggestions or opportunities they'd like to tell me, please don't hesitate to contact me, because everything helps.
Sheila, you had a question?
No, I have a suggestion. You just asked for suggestions.
I like suggestions. It's good.
Are you prepared to write articles for magazines?
Yeah, absolutely.
Then the BC Nature magazine goes to all BC Nature members throughout the province.
Wonderful.
So you're talking about nearly 4,000 members.
Excellent. I would love to. I would love the opportunity to do that.
I'll send you the information.
Please do. Thank you. That's a great suggestion. I didn't realize that the reach was that far. That's a lot of readership.
Yes, it is. All over BC, there's
Yeah.
naturalist clubs. Yes. Good idea.
Thank you. Thank you for that suggestion. I like that. Thank you.
Sylvia, did you have another question?
She's muted.
She's muted, so yeah.
Oh, I turned my mic off.
Okay, your hand was still up. So
I think I
was
have-
wondering if you asked a.
I could go on with another dozen questions, but I won't.
Fabulous. I think that's the most questions we've ever had in one of these presentations.
Wow.
That
Well,
was wonderful. Are there any more questions?
Sarah, are you a fishery biologist by occupation?
I'm not. I'm an armchair biologist. I've been doing. Thank you. That's high praise because I work with some pretty outstanding people, some of the best minds in population modeling, biology. But I've been in the fish world for almost 20 years, and more recently, I guess past 13 or 14 years in this role. And I love it. There's no 2 days are the same. There is so much to learn, and I've been so blessed with people being very generous with their knowledge. And so, but I do actually get that question quite often. So I thank you because that's such a compliment to me.
You're doing a great job for that association, that's for sure.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Fabulous.
Thank you.
I had one question.
Oh,
Are you guys still catching big ones that haven't been tagged?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It's always, it's awe-inspiring when it happens. My biggest one that I ever encountered was, it's a long story and I won't bore you with it now, but it was over 8 feet. And I had the opportunity to actually get in the water with this fish and have this experience. So to the point of the question of them being docile and so quiet and tired from their experience, I actually believe that in my circumstance, that fish just waited while we did our thing, and it let us do what we were doing because the fish several hundred pounds. They could have knocked me off, but it wasn't tagged and it was over 8 feet long. So it's so inspiring when we see those because it does give us hope that there's other big ones out there, that there's brood stock that's still there. And then that means hopefully if we do our job right, more juveniles, and then we'll see that uptake in the population.
Fantastic. Positive note to end on. I'm wondering if everyone can give Sarah a round of applause.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much.
Excellent.
It's really
Excellent.
a pleasure. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
And I'll get Karen to send the honorarium to your association. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. Lovely to meet you.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you. Bye.
Come back when
Alrighty,
you-
everybody.
Bye now.
Have a fantastic rest of your evening, and don't forget to vote.